Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So I'm in London, I'm opposite 32 De Vere Gardens, London. There's no garden here despite the name of the street. There you go. So this is the house of James Kenneth Stephen. That's why I'm doing it. I'm actually standing on the roads, I better get out of the way. So J.K. Stephen was born in 1859, not in this house, in another address at Gloucester Road. It's about a mile away. I'll go there some other time. He was born into a very distinguished family. He was to be the fourth generation of barristers in his family, and obviously it wasn't just strictly patrilineal. Some of his uncles, great uncles and so on, his brother and cousins had been barristers as well. So the family had come from Scotland in the 18th century and settled in southern England, though it was actually mostly English, because it was his great-great-grandfather was the last Scots of full blood. So he was the third of 10 children. He was born in February 1859, and his first cousin was the celebrated novelist Virginia Woolf, who was afflicted with bipolar disorder, just as J.K. Stephen was himself, and a number of other family members. I think his mother, one of his sisters, his father somewhat. So Virginia Woolf, her maiden name was Stephen, her father being Leslie Stephen, the paternal uncle of J.K. Stephen. So J.K. Stephen is often known as Jem Stephen, occasionally Jim, Jem, J-E-M. So his father, Sir Fitzjames Stephen, he went on to be a judge. His father's name was actually James Fitzjames Stephen, but he always went by his middle name Fitzjames to avoid confusion with his own father, who was James Stephen. Sir Fitzjames Stephen, he was appointed to the bench, and thereupon he was knighted. So he had a number of younger siblings. J.K. Stephen, and obviously older brother and older sister. Two of his younger siblings died in infancy, so that was 8 surviving children, 4 boys and 4 girls. But his parents weren't particularly close to them, and his father took an appointment as a judge in India and set sail for the subcontinent, spent 2.5 years out there, didn't come back in that time, because all this being the mid-19th century, the voyage took a few weeks, even with steamships and all that. And the mother then went out to visit the father, stayed there for a year and a half, and the youngest sister was born there. Anyway, so J.K. Stephen, he went to prep school early, boarding, as was the norm for upper middle class families at the time. He was blessed with most exceptional academic ability, as was his elder brother Herbert. And from his prep school, he was in one in Banbury, Oxfordshire, towards the end, run by a Reverend Browning, who was the brother of Oscar Browning. Oscar Browning, an Old Etonian, an Eton Beak as a teacher, housemaster, one of the most celebrated but also controversial teachers at Eton in the entire 19th century. So J.K. Stephen, he then won a King's Scholarship to Eton, which lies 18 miles west of here, founded by King Henry VI in 1440, most assuredly by far the most illustrious school on the planet. King's Scholarships, well, they were set up by Henry VI, that's what's called a King's Scholarship, 70 King's Scholars, and in those days there were several hundred oppidans, as in boys who were not scholars, who paid the fee to go there. So the Stephen family was quite well off, and they could have afforded the fees anyway, but yes, they weren't so staggeringly rich that having a scholarship made no difference to their finances. So he and his elder brother Herbert were there. The 2 younger brothers didn't go to Eton. I'm not sure where they were schooled or quite why, actually. But the parents are a little bit cold, a little bit preoccupied with the father's career, being abroad and so on. So J.K. Stephen, he thrived at Eton. So he lived in college, the oldest house in the school, which dates back to the 15th century, and was for the King's Scholars only. But then he also had a tutor, and the tutor was usually not your own housemaster, because every house had a housemaster. It could be any teacher in the school. So he chose Oscar Browning, who was housemaster of a house. So Oscar Browning got a salary for just teaching ordinary lessons at Eton, and he got a salary for boys choosing him as their tutor. You could pick your tutor. And a tutor could take up a maximum of 40 tutees. He'd teach them once or twice a week in very small groups. So it was quite a lot of individual attention, whereas in class there could be 50 boys quite easily. And then Oscar Browning also ran a house, and a boarding house at school was a private business. So the housemaster could run it as he wished, with almost no parameters for what he could do. So so long as he provided 3 meals a day, he could provide poor accommodation, good accommodation, and charge accordingly. So Oscar Browning tried to make it a home away from home. Bear in mind, these were very well-got boys from patrician families. He charged the highest fees at Eton, but provided lashings of delectable repasts. Well, what should I say, fare, and had it very well furnished. There was ample wood and coal for heating, and he hired plenty of boys' maids to clean the place. So it's very comfortable. And also the running costs were high, but it was so popular that he could charge astronomical fees, and very wealthy families were happy to have their sons go there. And he took a genuine interest in his pupils, saw himself as well. He was in loco parentis and was a paternal figure to them, really caring for them, giving them a great deal of his time, seldom finishing his duties till 10:30 at night. However, so J.K. Stephen went to that house almost every day. Oscar Browning, or OB as he known, was not his tutor, and OB was really a modernist, because classics was the mainstay of the curriculum, Latin and ancient Greek. But Oscar Browning said, no, we ought to introduce English literature as well. They used to say that English literature was what a gentleman read in his spare time, and Oscar Browning said, no, this is worthy of proper study, because English wasn't even a subject at universities in this country to the late 19th century. Now, some of the more reactionary Eton masters looked askance at this, didn't like it one bit. He organised concerts in his house, boys put on plays, so he liked a lot of amateur theatricals. But there was a more sinister side to Oscar Browning, because his affection towards his pupils seemed to overstep the bounds of propriety. His feelings for them were not merely avuncular, and he wrote letters to friends openly saying about kissing his pupils. Does that mean kissing them on the cheek, or what? Or winning kisses for them, and which boys that he loved, saying he loved them more than someone could love a son or a daughter or even a wife, which hints at sexual desire. Bearing in mind, some of these boys were as young as 12. Now, all homosexual acts were illegal at the time. Now, beyond kissing, which he freely admitted to, so far as we know, his sexual acts didn't go any further than the pupils, but it's still very morally questionable. But Oscar Browning, he clashed with the headmaster, Mr. Hornby, and the provost, Dr. Waugh. They were eventually able to give him the old heave-ho, because he broke the rule about having no more than 40 pupils. But did he molest J.K. Stephen? Possibly. If that did happen to J.K. Stephen, it's probable that J.K. Stephen wouldn't even recognise it as abusive, partly because of Victorian naivete, or these schoolmasters were on such a pedestal they just couldn't be criticised. Bear in mind, most teachers at Eton were clergy. They were ordained into the Church of England at the time, although Oscar Browning wasn't, actually. But he made good terms with his pupils for much of the rest of his life, regularly went on holiday, even when they were minors, taking them around France and Germany and Italy on cultural tours, which was also paid for holiday for him. But so J.K. Stephen, he did very well at Eton, as I said, and then he played the wall game. He was a very fine physical specimen. He stood 6 foot tall, at least, and that was in an era where the average height wasn't, say, 5'9", as it is now, it's more like 5'6". So he was head and shoulders above most people, although the upper orders tended to be quite bulky, because they were amply nourished. Remember, the plebes, should I say, I'm going to stick with Latin, they didn't have sufficient calcium or protein when they were in the developmental stage, so they were sort of skeletally underdeveloped, often had rickets, bow legs, and such like. So the working class had to be shorter than the upper class. So he left Eton in April. He didn't have to leave the certain time of the year, and he got himself a King's Scholarship to King's College, Cambridge, and the majority of King's College from Eton went on to King's Cambridge, which was also founded by Henry VI. The coat of arms was almost exactly the same, and until the 1850s, King's College, Cambridge had been exclusively for quondam King's Scholars of Eton, but it was opening up by that time. And you could easily go there, get your degree, and come back to Eton and have a very comfortable berth for the rest of your life. It was almost a sinecure. So, but he didn't do that. He read classics. Then he decided he wanted to become a barrister. He came down to London, and he was called to the bar. He joined Lincoln's Inn. He practiced in a desultory manner, but he also devoted himself to literary endeavours. He'd been president of the Cambridge Union, so he just carried off all the glittering prizes. And it seemed that this glorious path beckoned, because he was rising up cursus honorum in every single way. And he was a fantastic debater with a Theophrastic turn of phrase and a compendious vocabulary. His mind had been trained on the classics, so that's why he could easily turn his hand to composing witty and devastating orations. His powers of logical reasoning were almost incomparable. And that's why he could be a highly effectual barrister if he turned his mind to it. But actually, he seemed to find the law rather banal. His brother was decidedly more successful, Herbert, his elder brother. Oh yeah, but I should say, at Eton he played the wall game. He actually lacked the fine motor skills for certain sports. He wasn't particularly dexterous, but he had bulk and he had physical force, was good at shoving other boys out the way, and he single-handedly saved his house, college, from defeat. The St Andrews Day war game match, St Andrews Day, 30th of November, is the most important war game match in the calendar, because the furrow at Eton where the war game is played is about 100 metres long, as in you could plough along it, plough a furrow, and about 5 metres wide. It's really a scrum beside the wall for about an hour. And he single-handedly saved his team from oblivion, and that's why every St Andrews Day there's a lunch at college, and they say in PM Memoriam JKS, as in dutiful memory of J.K. Stephen. So he was also accorded the peerless honour of being the personal tutor of Prince Eddie. Prince Eddie, the eldest grandson of Queen Victoria, as in he's equivalent to Prince William now. So Prince Eddie was in line for the throne. And Prince Eddie was actually only academically average. I know rumours have abounded that he was academically subnormal. That's actually not true, especially if you see his handwritten letters. He was ordinary, but the idea was to prepare him for Cambridge. He'd only had private tutors, hadn't been schooled. Royalty didn't go to school till Prince Charles's generation. So he had to do this and also help out Prince Eddie whilst he was at Cambridge. Prince Eddie's name was actually Albert Victor Christian Edward, amongst the family who went by the last of those four names, Edward or Eddie, as was the wont of the Britannic royal house at the time. So J.K. Stephen didn't think much of his pupil, said he hardly knows the meaning of the word to read, but nevertheless he was not reprobated by the royal family, despite Prince Eddie not doing terribly well. And he left without a degree, as was the norm for royalty, and actually was considered no disgrace by a lot of the boys who went to Oxford or Cambridge to spend a year or two and to leave without a degree. People weren't fixated with qualifications as they are today. Perhaps 1% of the population went to university back then, so any experience in tertiary education put someone well ahead of what was the norm for the 19th century. Anyway, so J.K. Stephen, he came down to London for a while. He didn't want to pursue an academic career, being a barrister, and then he set up a magazine called The Reflector, which he funded out of his own pocket, and financially it was a flop, and many of the articles were written by him. And he knew a lot of people in literary London. Up at Cambridge, he'd been a member of the Apostles, that secretive society based out of Trinity. Even though it was at King's, he could join it. He was a member of the Savile Club, which is really sort of a grown-up version of the Apostles, and a large number of people in the Apostles were homosexual, likewise in the Savile Club. Was J.K. Stephen gay? We don't know, actually. He grew up in a very homosocial, if not homosexual, environment, so it's possible that he was, but I don't know of anyone who's attested, yes, I saw him do this, or he told me he did that. And in his late 20s, he did show some desire for women. There was a Mrs. Tennyson, as in the daughter-in-law of Alfred Lord Tennyson, and her husband suddenly died of an illness. And Mrs. Tennyson was back in London just months later. The 29-year-old J.K. Stephen paid court to her. She was 34, and she coquetted with him for a while, but eventually spurned him. He took it very badly. There was another lady he'd wanted to marry who'd also rejected him. So he'd had a bump on the head in the late 1880s, which seemed to affect him very gravely. His mental state started to deteriorate, though he did experience lucid episodes intermittently, but these became ever more fleeting and transient, whereas his episodes of derangement of the mind became more prolonged and ever more severe. So his family had a holiday house in Ireland. They usually went there for August and September, and Averna in County Louth, a bit north of Dublin. So anyway, in August 1888, Jack the Ripper struck at Whitehall, the east end of London, a very poverty-stricken area with a large Jewish immigrant population. There was quite a lot of anti-Semitism at the time. I won't go through all the particulars, but 5 prostitutes were murdered over the next couple of months. All was on the 8th, I think it was the 20th of the month. And so there appeared to be a pattern there. People have subsequently suspected J.K. Stephen, but I'll say more about it later. But was it him? People thought it was Prince Eddie, but on at least 2 of those 5 dates of the murders, Prince Eddie was recorded as being in Balmoral, Scotland, so it couldn't have been him unless the records were falsified. J.K. Stephen, we actually don't know the exact dates of his comings and goings to Ireland. He rarely spent the whole 2 months on the Emerald Isle. So people have been conjecturing that Prince Eddie and or his erstwhile tutor was the serial killer. But was it because he had such pathological hatred of women? Other thing is, J.K. Stephen, he was a very accomplished versifier. He published a volume that was well received called Lapsus Calami and Other Verses. Despite being acclaimed by many other poets, it didn't sell particularly well. It means a slip of the pen, which would have been well known to any classicist at the time. And it was partly pastiches of better established poets, such as Thomas Gray, also an old Etonian. It was a send-up of his celebrated work, An Ode to the Distant Prospect of Eton College. And some of his poesy reveals supposed insensate misogyny, and people thought, well, that squares with this insensate savagery of the murders in Whitechapel, where these women weren't just killed, weren't used as necessary force to kill them, but they were poignarded and lacerated far beyond what was needed to slay them, and the pudenda was slashed and the uterus was removed and things like that, which seems to be indicative of someone who is driven by this absolutely incandescent and overpowering hatred towards womankind, not towards these individuals. Anyway, and so there was the Cleveland Street scandal the next year, and Prince Eddie, his equerry, Lord Esher, was involved, accused of going to an underage male brothel. Nothing to do with Prince Eddie, but Prince Eddie, because there was some sort of taint even of his equerry, he went abroad for a year, tour of the empire. So by 1892, or 1891 really, rather, J.K. Stephen was really raving bonkers. He was living in Cambridge. He stood naked in his window for a while to show himself all the world. He was increasingly erratic. So he was sectioned, sent to a psychiatric hospital at Northampton called St Andrew's Hospital. Ironic, given that the St Andrews match was his moment of glory. And he was there, and he was very dispirited. He seemed to suffer anhedona, avolition, and then Prince Eddie was stricken with pneumonia at Sandringham at the time, and had a decline with extraordinary rapidity, and died that January. And the news was conveyed to J.K. Stephen that his former pupil had died. People used to say it was his gay paramour. Again, I don't know of a shred of evidence of that. That's sheer guesswork. Stephen, despite visits from his brother and his sister, he wouldn't rally. He started refusing food, and he died of mania, as was said, in February 1892. He was aged just 32. Or had he quite turned 33? He might have turned 33. I can't remember when in February his birthday was. So he's laid to rest at the family tomb at Kensal Green Cemetery in London. I must go and visit sometime. Now, 90 years after his death, I moved into this street. And I found out about J.K. Stephen when I was 16. I've been fascinated by it all my life. And having no idea, I lived on the same street as him. And his cousins, Virginia Woolf, she lived 4 streets that away, the same street that Churchill lived on. They lived directly opposite Robert Browning, the Stephen family, Henry James, the celebrated British-American novelist, lived in the street. So it was a very des res. So I'll touch this pillar. And surely he must have touched this pillar at some point, even higher up, I don't know, to commune with him, to connect with him. There's someone I found absolutely intriguing all my life. Wished to pen the first biography of him, though actually someone's beaten me to it. Well, that's just a little bit about J.K. Stephen, Jem Stephen, who some suspect of being Jack the Ripper, though I think it highly improbable myself. There are about 100 suspects, and there are others like Montague John Druitt, who are much more credible as suspects for the murder. I know J.K. Stephen's, his chambers was only about 2 miles from Whitechapel, where the murders took place. You know, a man of his physique and fitness could have walked there in half an hour, or get a hansom cab, a tube, a tram, a bus, and so on. So anyway, that's probably enough from me. So please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and so forth. A book online lessons with me in history, politics, religious studies, citizenship, French, English language, English literature, English as a foreign language, life in the UK test, IELTS, SSAT, SAT, and so forth. And obviously I do 7+, 11+, 13+, GCSEs, A-levels, IB. I help people at university with theses, essays, dissertations, interview preparation, and the like. So thank you for your most generous donations on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's GeorgeCallahan 79 at gmail.com. Toodle pip.